Imagine a king so powerful that no one dared question him. A ruler who changed an entire nation's religion out for faith, not for reform but because he wanted a divorce. A monarch whose closest friends became enemies and whose enemies rarely survived. This is the story of how Henry VIII transformed from a charming Renaissance prince into England's most feared monarch. In the summer of 1509, a young prince stepped into a role that would shape not only his own destiny but the future of an entire kingdom. That prince was Henry VIII, and at the moment of his coronation, few could have imagined that he would one day be remembered as one of the most intimidating rulers in English history. To his contemporaries, he did not appear dangerous, unpredictable, or tyrannical. Instead, he seemed to embody everything a Renaissance monarch ought to be: cultured, energetic, confident, and deeply invested in the ideals of chivalry and humanist learning that were spreading across Europe. He had not originally been destined for the throne. Born the second son of Henry VII, he was raised in the relative freedom afforded to a spare heir. His elder brother Arthur had been carefully trained for kingship, while the younger Henry received an education designed to prepare him for a supporting role within the royal family, or perhaps a high ecclesiastical office. This distinction proved decisive in shaping his early character. Free from the relentless political pressure placed upon a direct heir, he developed a personality that was remarkably vibrant and expressive. He learned languages, studied theology, practiced music, and immersed himself in the intellectual currents of the age. By the time he reached adolescence, he could debate scholars, compose devotional works, and perform at court with both athletic grace and artistic talent. Arthur's sudden death in 1502 changed everything. The responsibility of succession shifted overnight to the younger brother, transforming his path from that of a cultivated nobleman to the future sovereign of England. Yet even as expectations altered, the education he had already received left a lasting impression. Unlike many rulers formed solely by the harsh necessities of power, Henry entered kingship with the mind of a scholar and the tastes of a Renaissance prince. He admired classical learning, surrounded himself with educated advisors, and saw monarchy not merely as authority but as performancy and opportunity to display magnificence, intellect, and vitality before both his court and foreign ambassadors. When his father died in April 1509, the transition of power was remarkably smooth. The Tudor dynasty was still relatively new, having secured the crown only a generation earlier after decades of civil war. Stability mattered immensely. The young king understood that he must appear strong, legitimate, and inspiring. His coronation was therefore staged as a grand affirmation of continuity and renewal. London erupted in celebration, filled with elaborate pageantry, religious ceremonies, and tournaments that showcased the new monarch's physical prowess. Observers described him as tall and striking, with a commanding presence that combined youthful enthusiasm with regal confidence. He excelled in jousting, hunting, and archery, embracing the medieval ideal of the warrior king even as he cultivated the refined image of a Renaissance ruler. In these early years, he deliberately distanced himself from some of the harsher financial policies associated with his father's reign. Henry VII had governed cautiously, strengthening royal authority through careful management of revenue and strict control over the nobility. The new king, eager to win affection, adopted a more generous style. Prisoners detained under the previous administration were released, and lavish celebrations became common. This shift created an atmosphere of optimism. The people of England saw not only a legitimate successor, but a ruler who seemed eager to share prosperity and glory with his subjects. The court itself became a center of culture and display. Musicians, poets, theologians, and diplomats gathered around the young monarch, drawn by his enthusiasm for learning and conversation. He played instruments such as the lute and organ, composed melodies, and participated in elaborate masques that blended theater, symbolism, and political messaging. His presence was not passive. He was often the most energetic participant, eager to demonstrate that he could equal or surpass any nobleman in skill or intellect. Such performances reinforced the perception that England now possessed a king who embodied both strength and sophistication. Diplomatically, he entered the European stage with ambition. The early 16th century was dominated by powerful figures such as Francis I of France and the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, rulers who viewed kingship as both rivalry and spectacle. Henry sought recognition among them not through fear but through prestige. He envisioned England as an equal player in continental politics, capable of commanding respect through alliances, displays of wealth, and occasional military ventures. His participation in tournaments and diplomatic meetings was calculated to project vigor and legitimacy. At this point he desired admiration rather than submission, reputation rather than intimidation. Religion, too, played an important role in shaping his early identity. He was a devout Catholic, attentive to ritual and theology, and proud of his reputation as a defender of the faith. He attended Mass regularly, engaged in theological discussion, and viewed himself as a guardian of spiritual as well as temporal order. His later break with Rome would make this phase seem ironic to historians, but at the time there was no hint of rebellion against established religious authority. On the contrary, Henry's orthodoxy was seen as one of his defining virtues. A key event of this hopeful period was his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, the widow of his late brother. The union had been carefully negotiated to preserve an alliance between England and Spain, and it carried immense symbolic weight. By marrying Catherine, Henry reinforced dynastic continuity while strengthening ties with one of Europe's most powerful royal houses. Their wedding was celebrated with magnificence, presenting the image of a harmonious partnership that promised both political stability and future heirs. Contemporary observers described their relationship as affectionate and respectful, further enhancing the king's popularity. The early Tudor court thrived on ceremony designed to project order after the chaos of the 15th century. Every procession, feast, and tournament was meant to reassure the realm that the monarchy was secure. Henry reveled in these rituals. He rode at the head of glittering cavalcades, presided over elaborate banquets, and staged contests in which he personally competed. Such acts were not mere entertainment. They were demonstrations of vitality meant to convince subjects that their ruler possessed both the strength to defend them and the refinement to lead them into a new era of cultural achievement. Education and intellectual curiosity also distinguished him from many predecessors. He corresponded with scholars, supported the study of classical texts, and showed genuine interest in debates about philosophy and morality. Humanist thinkers praised him as a model Christian prince, one who combined learning with authority. This reputation extended beyond England's borders, contributing to an international image of a kingdom emerging from isolation into active engagement with Renaissance Europe. Yet beneath this promising surface lay subtle pressures that would later shape his transformation. The Tudor claim to the throne, though established, was still relatively new, and memories of civil war lingered. Stability depended heavily on producing heirs and maintaining loyalty among powerful nobles. Even during these optimistic years, the machinery of governance required vigilance. Henry's charisma masked the fact that kingship demanded constant assertion of legitimacy. Every celebration, every alliance, every public display served to reinforce a dynasty that had not yet stood the test of centuries. The young monarch, however, experienced these responsibilities not as burdens but as opportunities. He saw himself as chosen to lead England into greatness, blending medieval traditions of honor with the intellectual revival sweeping across Europe. Hunting expeditions filled the royal calendar, along with diplomatic receptions and athletic competitions. He rose early, remained physically active, and cultivated a sense of personal invincibility. Those who met him often remarked on his boundless energy and confidence. In this atmosphere, fear played almost no role in governance. Loyalty was inspired by admiration, reinforced by spectacle, and sustained by the belief that England was entering a golden age. The king laughed easily, rewarded service generously, and sought glory in ways that aligned with the chivalric ideals he so admired. His court was not yet a place of whispered caution, but one of lively participation, where nobles sought favor through excellence rather than mere survival. Looking back, historians often emphasize how different this early Henry was from the ruler he would become. There was little indication of the suspicion or ruthlessness that later defined his reign. Instead, he projected openness, enthusiasm, and a desire to be loved by his people. He jousted not because he needed to assert dominance, but because he delighted in competition. He debated theology because he relished intellectual challenge. He spent lavishly because magnificence, in his view, reflected the dignity of kingship itself. The contrast between expectation and outcome makes this period all the more significant. England in 1509 did not brace itself under a shadow of oppression, it celebrated under banners of hope. Foreign envoys reported that the new king was admired by his subjects and eager to earn distinction among Europe's rulers. The monarchy appeared secure, the alliance with Spain promising, and the cultural life of the court flourishing. This was the foundation upon which everything else would be built. The later severity of Henry's reign cannot be understood without recognizing how far he seemed, at first, from becoming a feared monarch. He began as a figure of possibility, a ruler shaped by education, confidence, and the optimism of a nation ready to believe in renewal. Only gradually, under the weight of dynastic anxiety, political conflict, and personal determination, would that bright image harden into something far more formidable. In these opening years, however, there was no sign of the iron authority that would later define his rule. There was only a young king standing at the center of a vibrant court, convinced that he could achieve greatness through brilliance, strength, and the admiration of his people. The confidence and brilliance that marked the early reign of Henry VIII were gradually overshadowed by a single consuming concern, the question of succession. In the 16th century, monarchy was not merely a personal inheritance, but the fragile center of political stability. The memory of dynastic conflict still lingered in England, and the Tudor claim to the throne, though secure for the moment, lacked the deep historical roots that protected older royal houses in Europe. For Henry, the need to produce a legitimate male heir was not simply a matter of pride or tradition. It was a matter he believed would determine whether peace endured or chaos returned. At first, there seemed little reason for alarm. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon had been welcomed across Europe as both a diplomatic success and a continuation of dynastic stability. Catherine was experienced in royal life, politically astute, and deeply devout. She quickly adapted to her role as queen, earning respect among courtiers and subjects alike. Their partnership appeared harmonious, grounded in mutual duty and shared faith. For several years, there was every expectation that the marriage would produce sons who would carry the Tudor line securely into the future. But the reality proved tragically different. Catherine experienced multiple pregnancies, yet many of the children were stillborn or died within weeks of birth. Each loss was not only a personal sorrow but a political disappointment that reverberated through the court. Royal births were public events, filled with elaborate prayers, ceremonies, and proclamations of hope. Royal deaths, especially those of infants, were quieter but no less devastating in their implications. With each failed pregnancy, anxiety deepened among those who understood how much depended on the survival of a male child. In 1516, a daughter was born who survived infancy, Mary Thirst of England. Her arrival was celebrated, and Henry showed genuine affection toward her. Yet even in the midst of joy, there remained an unspoken recognition that a daughter could not entirely resolve the question of succession. England had never successfully accepted a reigning queen in her own right, and the prospect raised fears of disputed claims, foreign influence through marriage, and renewed factional rivalry among the nobility. Mary's birth ensured continuity, but not the kind of certainty Henry believed the kingdom required. At first, Henry approached the problem with patience. He was still young, and there was every reason to believe more children would follow. Years passed, however, and Catherine's pregnancies became less frequent. As time moved on, the king's confidence slowly eroded. The cheerful optimism that had defined his early reign gave way to unease. He began to interpret events not merely as misfortune but as signs carrying deeper meaning. Religion played a crucial role in shaping his thoughts. Henry lived in a world where divine will was believed to guide earthly outcomes, especially those affecting rulers. The repeated failure to produce a surviving son did not seem random, it appeared, to his increasingly troubled mind, as evidence of judgment. He turned to scripture and theological argument, searching for explanations that could make sense of what he perceived as a pattern of denial. Among the passages that troubled him most were those suggesting that a man who married his brother's widow might incur divine displeasure. Though papal dispensation had allowed his marriage to Catherine, Henry began to question whether human authority could truly override what he now interpreted as God's law. This shift marked a turning point not only in policy but in personality. Where he had once been expansive and carefree, he now became introspective and determined. The question of succession no longer sat at the edges of governance, it dominated his thinking. Every year that passed without a son heightened his urgency. The Tudor dynasty, founded only recently by his father, seemed to him perpetually at risk. If he failed to secure a male heir, he feared that everything his family had fought to build might dissolve. The atmosphere at court subtly changed. Conversations once filled with music, literature, and sport increasingly revolved around alliances, lineage, and the possibility of remarriage. Advisors found themselves drawn into delicate discussions about theology and law as Henry sought validation for doubts he was no longer willing to ignore. Some urged caution, reminding him of Catherine's loyalty and the legitimacy of their union. Others, sensing the king's determination, explored arguments that might justify a different course. Henry's own sense of kingship intensified this struggle. He believed deeply in the sacred responsibility entrusted to him as monarch. To fail in providing a secure succession seemed, in his mind, not merely unfortunate but negligent. Kingship was not a temporary stewardship, it was a divine trust meant to extend across generations. The absence of a son began to feel like a personal inadequacy, a failure to fulfill the role history and providence had assigned to him. This internal pressure gradually reshaped how he interpreted loyalty and duty. Catherine, once regarded as a partner in ensuring dynastic stability, came to be seen, however, reluctantly as part of the problem. Their marriage, once celebrated as a foundation of peace, now appeared to Henry as an obstacle preventing the future he believed necessary for England's survival. The emotional complexity of this shift should not be underestimated. For many years he had respected her, relied upon her counsel, and trusted in their shared mission. Yet the demands of kingship, as he understood them, began to outweigh personal attachment. Meanwhile, the broader European context reinforced his anxiety. Other monarchies boasted multiple heirs, strengthening their dynasties and ensuring smooth transitions of power. Comparisons were unavoidable. Henry saw himself not only as England's ruler but as a competitor on the continental stage, where strength was measured in lineage as well as military and political success. The lack of a male successor risked diminishing England's standing and inviting uncertainty among allies and rivals alike. As these concerns mounted, Henry's determination hardened into resolve. He became convinced that action was required, that passively accepting circumstances would amount to abandoning his responsibility. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. The vibrant prince who had once delighted in tournaments and scholarship now devoted increasing energy to questions of legitimacy, inheritance, and divine approval. He studied legal precedents, consulted theologians, and examined biblical texts with the intensity of someone seeking not merely understanding but justification. Those around him began to sense that the issue had moved beyond discussion into conviction. Henry no longer spoke of the succession as a hope to be fulfilled within his existing marriage. He spoke of it as a problem demanding remedy. This conviction would eventually lead him toward decisions that reshaped England's religious and political landscape, but at this stage it manifested primarily as a growing impatience with delay and contradiction. The psychological burden of uncertainty affected his temperament. While still capable of charm and generosity, he displayed flashes of frustration when confronted with obstacles. The same confidence that had once inspired admiration now fueled an unwillingness to accept limits placed upon his will. If kingship was divinely ordained, he reasoned, then securing its future must also be divinely sanctioned. Opposition, therefore, appeared not simply mistaken but contrary to a higher purpose he believed himself called to fulfill. Thus, the succession crisis did more than raise a political dilemma, it altered Henry's understanding of authority itself. The need for a son became intertwined with his conception of duty, faith, and legitimacy. In seeking certainty for the future, he began to reshape the present according to his own interpretation of necessity. The seeds of later conflict, religious, political, and personnel, were planted in these years of mounting concern. What had begun as a hopeful reign now stood at a crossroads. The absence of a male heir, repeated and undeniable, pressed upon Henry's conscience with increasing weight. He was no longer merely a celebrated Renaissance king enjoying the privileges of power. He was a ruler confronting what he believed to be a threat to his dynasty, his kingdom, and even his soul. The choices he would make in response to that fear would transform not only his character but the entire course of English history. As the question of succession grew from a concern into an obsession, the king's search for a solution gradually drew him into a conflict far greater than a troubled marriage. What had once been a private dynastic anxiety now intersected with the authority of the Church, the traditions of Europe, and the limits of royal power itself. At the center of this turning point stood a woman whose presence at court would alter the direction of English history, Anne Boleyn. Anne was not a conventional court figure. Having spent years in the sophisticated courts of the Low Countries and France, she possessed a sharp intellect, confidence in conversation, and an understanding of politics unusual for women of her time. She was fluent in the language of courtly love, but refused to become merely another royal mistress. Unlike others who had attracted the king's attention, Anne insisted on marriage as the condition of any relationship. This refusal intrigued him. What began as fascination deepened into emotional dependence, and soon Henry convinced himself that Anne was not only desirable but necessary both personally and dynastically. Anne's influence coincided with the king's growing belief that his marriage to Catherine had never been valid in the eyes of God. Where earlier doubts had been private and uncertain, they now hardened into arguments he actively sought to defend. Scholars were consulted, biblical passages debated, and legal theories constructed. The matter was framed not as a desire for change, but as the correction of a supposed wrong that had brought divine displeasure upon the realm. By persuading himself that his cause was righteous, Henry transformed a personal decision into what he considered a moral obligation. To secure an annulment, he turned to Rome, expecting that the papacy would recognize the gravity of his situation. Yet the political realities of Europe complicated matters. The Pope Clement VII, was caught between competing powers, including Catherine's nephew. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, granting Henry's request, risked angering one of the most powerful rulers in Christendom. Delaying or refusing it risked alienating England. The result was hesitation, negotiation, and procedural delay responses that Henry interpreted not as diplomacy, but as obstruction. Years passed without resolution. What Henry had expected to be a straightforward legal matter became an exhausting stalemate. Special courts were convened, testimonies heard, and arguments presented, yet no final decision emerged. The king's frustration grew sharper with each passing month. He had come to believe that his authority, his conscience, and the future of his dynasty were being held hostage by distant officials who neither understood England's needs nor respected his sovereignty. During this prolonged struggle, Henry's perception of kingship underwent a fundamental change. He began to question whether a foreign religious authority should possess the power to decide matters affecting the English crown. If he were truly God's anointed ruler, responsible for the welfare of his people, why should another figure claim jurisdiction over his marriage and succession? This question, once unthinkable, gradually became central to his thinking. Supporters within England began to echo these arguments. Some were motivated by genuine conviction, others by loyalty, and still others by the opportunities such a shift might create. They advanced the idea that the English monarchy had always possessed a degree of spiritual independence, and that appeals to Rome were historical developments rather than eternal necessities. By reframing the dispute as one of national sovereignty rather than marital legality, they provided Henry with a path forward that did not rely on papal approval. The king's determination intensified. What he could not obtain through negotiation, he now considered achieving through assertion. Parliament was drawn into the conflict, passing measures that gradually restricted the authority of Rome within England. Legal appeals to the papacy were curtailed. Revenues traditionally sent abroad were redirected. Each act, taken individually, seemed administrative collectively. They marked a decisive shift in power. This process unfolded carefully, not as a sudden rebellion but as a calculated redefinition of authority. Henry did not initially present himself as rejecting the Church's teachings. Rather, he claimed to be restoring proper order, placing responsibility for spiritual governance within the realm where it belonged. The distinction allowed him to argue that he remained a faithful Christian, even while challenging the structures that had long defined Western Christendom. The culmination of these developments came with the formal establishment of the Church of England, an institution that recognized the monarch, not the pope, as its supreme earthly head. This act represented far more than an administrative change. It was a declaration that England would determine its own religious and political course, guided by the authority of its king. The consequences were immediate and profound. Those who accepted the new order swore oaths acknowledging royal supremacy. Those who hesitated found themselves in a perilous position. What had once been theological disagreement was now treated as disobedience to the crown. The boundary between faith and loyalty dissolved, binding religious conformity directly to political allegiance. For Henry, this transformation resolved the immediate obstacle to his remarriage. Freed from papal jurisdiction, he proceeded to declare his union with Catherine invalid and to marry Anne Boleyn. Yet the deeper significance of his actions extended far beyond personal fulfillment. By redefining the relationship between monarchy and church, he had altered the structure of English governance itself. The king who had once sought approval from established authority now claimed the right to define that authority. His earlier frustration evolved into a new vision of sovereignty, one in which obedience to the monarch encompassed both civil and spiritual life. This shift did not occur overnight, nor was it without resistance, but it marked the beginning of a system in which royal will carried unprecedented weight. What began as a quest for an heir had thus escalated into a reordering of power across the nation. The break with Rome was not simply an act of defiance. It was the moment when Henry asserted that no external force could overrule his judgment within his own kingdom. In doing so, he laid the foundation for a style of rule increasingly defined by control, certainty, and the expectation of unquestioned loyalty to developments that would shape the remainder of his reign. and contribute greatly to the fear he would later inspire. As the new religious settlement took hold, the authority of the crown expanded in ways that few in England had ever witnessed before. What had begun as a dispute over marriage and succession now evolved into a sweeping reorganization of power, guided by the will of Henry VIII and enforced through a combination of legislation, loyalty, and calculated intimidation. The king no longer saw himself merely as a ruler operating within inherited traditions. He increasingly viewed himself as the central force shaping those traditions, with both the right and responsibility to redefine them. To carry out these changes, Henry relied on capable administrators who understood how to translate royal intention into practical governance. Among the most influential was Thomas Cromwell, a man of remarkable organizational skill and political insight. Cromwell recognized that the king's break with Rome required not only theological justification but also structural transformation. Laws had to be rewritten, institutions reoriented, and the machinery of state adjusted to reflect the new order. Under his direction, Parliament became an essential instrument of royal policy, passing statutes that steadily reinforced the supremacy of the crown over both church and state. One of the most significant developments during this period was the systematic assertion of control over religious life throughout the kingdom. The newly established Church of England did not merely replace papal authority with another distant institution. It placed ecclesiastical governance directly under royal supervision. Bishops, clergy, and officials were required to acknowledge the monarch's supremacy, and refusal was treated not as a difference of conscience but as an act of defiance against lawful authority. This fusion of spiritual and political obedience fundamentally altered how power was experienced in everyday life. Faith, once mediated through a vast international structure, was now inseparable from loyalty to the king. The implications of this change became dramatically visible through the campaign known as the Dissolution of the Monasteries. For centuries, monasteries had been deeply woven into the social and economic fabric of England. They served not only as centers of prayer but also as providers of charity, education, and local stability. To many people, they represented continuity with the past, linking communities to traditions stretching back generations. Yet to Henry and his advisors, these institutions also symbolized allegiance to the old religious order and possessed immense wealth that lay beyond direct royal control. Investigations were launched into monastic life, producing reports that emphasized alleged corruption, inefficiency, or moral decline. Whether these accusations reflected reality or were shaped to justify policy remains debated, but they provided the rationale for sweeping action. Monasteries were closed, their lands seized, their treasures catalogued and redistributed. The scale of the operation was unprecedented. Vast estates passed into the hands of the crown, transforming Henry into one of the wealthiest monarchs England had ever known. This redistribution of property served multiple purposes. Financially, it strengthened the monarchy, providing resources that could be used to fund government, reward supporters, and reinforce military readiness. Politically, it bound influential nobles and gentry more closely to the king, as many received former monastic lands in exchange for loyalty. Socially, however, the changes created deep uncertainty. Communities that had relied on monasteries for aid or employment found themselves abruptly cut off. Ancient buildings were dismantled or repurposed, their disappearance signaling that even the most established institutions were not beyond the reach of royal command. Resistance did arise, most notably in the northern regions where attachment to traditional religion remained strong. Large numbers of people joined protests demanding the restoration of familiar practices and institutions. These movements revealed that the king's policies, though legally enacted, were far from universally accepted. Henry responded first with negotiation, issuing promises that suggested compromise might be possible. Yet once opposition was contained, reprisals followed. Leaders of resistance were arrested and executed, and the crown reasserted control with unmistakable firmness. Such responses reinforced a new understanding of monarchy. Earlier English kings had certainly exercised authority, but they had often done so in negotiation with powerful interests or long-standing customs. Henry's government, by contrast, demonstrated a willingness to override precedent entirely when it conflicted with royal objectives. The message conveyed was clear: tradition no longer guaranteed survival. What mattered was alignment with the direction set by the crown. At court, these transformations reshaped behavior as well as policy. Advancement increasingly depended on demonstrating unwavering support for the king's initiatives. Ambiguity or hesitation could be interpreted as disloyalty. Men who had once built reputations through independent counsel now measured their words carefully, aware that influence depended on remaining in harmony with the royal will. The atmosphere became more disciplined, more cautious, and less forgiving of dissent. Henry himself seemed to grow more confident as these measures succeeded. Each victorial, financial, or political confirmed his belief that decisive action produced stability. Where he had once sought validation from external authorities, he now trusted his own judgment above all. This confidence, however, carried a hardening edge. Having overcome resistance from Rome and from domestic critics, he grew less inclined to tolerate disagreement of any kind. The exercise of power became not only a necessity but a habit. Meanwhile, the cultural symbolism of monarchy evolved to match its expanding authority. Royal proclamations emphasized obedience and unity under the sovereign. Ceremonies reinforced the idea that England's religious and political identity flowed from the person of the king. Even the physical landscape reflected the shift, as former monastic lands were reorganized into estates that proclaimed the triumph of royal governance over ancient ecclesiastical independence. For many subjects, these years were bewildering. Practices that had defined worship and community life for generations vanished or changed rapidly. Yet open resistance became increasingly risky. The government possessed new administrative tools, improved record-keeping, and a clearer capacity to enforce compliance across the realm. Law courts, local officials, and royal commissioners formed a network through which the crown's authority could reach into distant regions with unprecedented consistency. Thus, the expansion of royal power during this phase was not a single dramatic act, but a sustained process of consolidation. Through legislation, economic redistribution, and firm responses to opposition, Henry reshaped England into a state more centralized than ever before. The monarchy emerged not only as the head of government, but as the defining force behind national identity and religious expression. By the end of this transformation, the relationship between ruler and realm had fundamentally changed. Obedience was no longer mediated through layers of tradition or shared authority, it was directed squarely toward the crown. The king who had once dazzled his court with athleticism and learning now commanded a system capable of enforcing his policies across every level of society. This consolidation of control did not yet represent the final stage of his evolution, but it laid the groundwork for the atmosphere of caution and fear that would later define perceptions of his rule. As the structures of royal authority strengthened, life within the court of Henry VIII began to change in ways that were less visible than acts of parliament or religious reform, yet far more revealing of the king's evolving character. The royal court, once celebrated as a lively center of music, learning, and display, gradually transformed into an environment defined by calculation, caution, and an acute awareness of how quickly favor could turn into danger. Power was no longer expressed only through laws and proclamations. It was felt in personal relationships, shifting alliances, and the growing realization that proximity to the king could be as perilous as it was prestigious. In earlier years, courtiers had competed for attention through wit, talent, and service. Now they competed through vigilance. The king's expectations had become more exacting, and his patience for disagreement had diminished. Those who advised him learned to frame their counsel carefully, aligning it with what they believed he already intended. Honest debate, once welcomed as part of Renaissance kingship, gave way to cautious affirmation. The atmosphere did not change overnight, but by degrees through incidents that demonstrated how swiftly fortunes could rise or collapse. One of the clearest examples of this new uncertainty was the fate of Anne Boleyn. For a time she had stood at the very center of Henry's ambitions, the figure for whom he had reshaped England's religious alignment and risked international isolation. As queen, she represented the success of his long struggle to secure a new marriage and, he hoped, a male heir. Yet her position proved far less secure than it had appeared. When she failed to produce the longed-for son and court factions turned against her, the same machinery of authority that had elevated her now moved decisively in another direction. Accusations were brought forward serious, shocking, and still debated by historians for their credibility. Anne was arrested, tried, and ultimately executed. The swiftness of her fall stunned observers. If a queen, crowned with such ceremony and backed by the king's own determination, could be condemned within a matter of weeks, what safety could anyone else claim? Her death sent a message more powerful than any statute. Royal favor was conditional, and its withdrawal could be final. The king remarried soon afterward, taking Jane Seymour as his third wife. Jane's demeanor contrasted sharply with Anne's, emphasizing obedience and gentleness, qualities that seemed to promise the stability Henry desired. When she gave birth to a son, future Edward VIII, appeared that the central crisis of the succession had finally been resolved. Henry's joy was profound, but it was shadowed by tragedy when Jane died shortly after childbirth. The loss affected him deeply, reinforcing both his longing for security and his sense that happiness was fragile and easily taken away. These personal upheavals contributed to a broader shift in how the king viewed loyalty. Where he had once relied on long-standing friendships, he now evaluated individuals primarily through their usefulness and reliability in maintaining order. The court became a place where reputation alone could not guarantee survival. Even those who had served faithfully for years could find themselves under suspicion if they appeared out of step with the king's wishes. The downfall of Thomas Cromwell illustrated this dynamic with particular clarity. Cromwell had been instrumental in implementing many of the reforms that strengthened Henry's authority, orchestrating administrative, legal, and financial changes with remarkable efficiency. Yet when political circumstances shifted and a royal marriage he arranged proved unsatisfactory, Cromwell's influence evaporated. Arrested and executed, he became another example of how swiftly the balance of trust could reverse. Such episodes reshaped the psychology of the court. Ambition remained strong, but it was tempered by caution. Courtiers monitored not only their own words but also the alliances they formed, aware that association with a disgraced figure could prove dangerous. Conversations were measured, correspondence guarded, and expressions of opinion carefully aligned with prevailing expectations. Advancement required not merely talent but an instinct for survival within a system increasingly centered on the monarch's personal judgment. Henry's later marriage to Catherine Howard further underscored the unpredictability of royal favor. Catherine, young and initially adored by the aging king, briefly restored an atmosphere of celebration. Yet revelations about her past led to charges of misconduct, and she too was executed. The repetition of such dramatic reversals deepened the sense that the court operated according to rules that could change without warning. What had once seemed exceptional now appeared part of a pattern. Beyond the palace walls, news of these events circulated widely, shaping public perception of the monarchy. Executions of prominent figures, once rare enough to shock the nation, became more frequent. Each carried symbolic weight, demonstrating that authority extended even to the highest ranks of society. The king's justice, whether viewed as necessary or severe, was unmistakably personal in its direction and consequences. This climate did not eliminate loyalty indeed. Many remained devoted to Henry, crediting him with preserving stability and asserting England's independence. But loyalty was increasingly expressed through conformity rather than candid counsel. The court's culture adjusted to accommodate a ruler who expected agreement and interpreted resistance as a challenge to order itself. The transformation of court life during these years reveals how power can alter relationships as much as institutions. The same palace that had once echoed with music and intellectual exchange now carried an undercurrent of watchfulness. Ceremony remained elaborate, yet beneath the splendor lay an awareness that status depended entirely upon the monarch's confidence. Favor could elevate a family to prominence, disfavor could erase it from influence entirely. By the later part of Henry's reign, the Tudor court had become a place where authority radiated outward from a single figure with unprecedented intensity. Service to the king was no longer simply a path to honor, it was a test of constant alignment with his expectations. In this environment, admiration and fear were no longer separate forces but intertwined realities, shaping how individuals behaved, spoke, and even thought within the orbit of royal power. Through these developments, the court itself became an instrument of governance. Its shifting alliances, dramatic rises and falls, and unmistakable demonstrations of consequence reinforced the broader message already evident in national policy, that the stability of England depended upon obedience to the sovereign, and that the sovereign's will was not to be questioned lightly. In the final years of his reign, the figure who had once dazzled Europe as a vigorous Renaissance prince bore little resemblance to the aging monarch who now governed England. Time, injury, and the accumulated weight of decades in power reshaped both the body and the temperament of Henry VIII. A severe jousting accident years earlier had left lasting damage to his leg, and as he aged the wound worsened, causing chronic pain, limited mobility, and recurring infections. Once known for athletic grace and physical confidence, he could no longer participate in the tournaments and hunts that had symbolized his youthful vitality. Instead, he ruled increasingly from enclosed spaces, surrounded by attendants, documents, and the rituals of authority rather than the activities that had once defined his kingship. Physical suffering had profound psychological effects. Chronic pain can narrow a person's world, and for a monarch accustomed to action and admiration, that narrowing was especially stark. Movement became difficult, and frustration replaced the exuberance that had once energized the court. The king's temper grew more unpredictable, shaped by discomfort and the awareness of mortality. Where earlier he had projected confidence in the future, he now confronted the reality that his own time was limited, and that the stability he had fought to secure must endure beyond his lifetime. This awareness intensified his concern for succession, even after finally achieving the long-sought birth of a legitimate son, the future Edward Fry. The boy's existence resolved one crisis but created another. The heir was still a child, vulnerable to illness and political manipulation. Henry knew well how fragile dynasties could be, and he became determined to construct a system strong enough to protect the throne during the minority of his successor. Laws, councils, and regency plans were carefully arranged, reflecting his desire to control events even after his death. Yet securing the succession required more than naming an heir. It required defining the religious and political character of the realm that heir would inherit. The establishment of the Church of England had already severed ties with Rome, but its doctrines and practices continued to evolve during Henry's later years. He sought a balance that preserved many traditional elements of worship while maintaining the independence he had claimed. This effort to stabilize religious identity reflected both conviction and caution. Too much change risked unrest, too little might undermine the authority he had asserted. The result was a settlement that bore the unmistakable imprint of his personal will, combining continuity with innovation in a way that only a monarch wielding such centralized power could achieve. Within the government, administration grew more structured and bureaucratic. Record-keeping expanded, financial systems became more organized, and royal councils assumed greater responsibility for managing daily affairs. These developments were not merely technical improvements, they represented the maturation of a state increasingly defined by centralized authority. Henry's earlier actions had dismantled competing sources of influence, and now the machinery of governance reflected that consolidation. Orders flowed outward from the crown with greater efficiency, reaching local officials who enforced them with a clarity that earlier generations might have found startling. At the same time, the memory of past upheavals lingered. Executions, dissolutions, and rapid policy shifts had taught the political nation to expect decisive action from the monarch. Even in moments of relative calm, the potential for sudden change remained an unspoken reality. The king's reputation for firmness, admired by supporters, feared by critics, had become an enduring aspect of his rule. People no longer judged royal authority solely by tradition or lineage, they judged it by the unmistakable capacity to act, command, and, when deemed necessary, punish. Henry's family life in these closing years reflected both continuity and tension. His daughters, Mary Thirst of England and Elizabeth Thirst, were restored to positions within the line of succession, though their legitimacy and religious affiliations remained matters of political sensitivity. By including them, Henry attempted to safeguard the dynasty against the uncertainties of mortality. If Edward failed to survive, the crown would still pass within the Tudor bloodline, preventing rival claims from destabilizing the realm. The king's later reign thus became an exercise in consolidation, securing institutions, clarifying succession, and reinforcing the authority he had spent decades expanding. Unlike the bold, dramatic gestures that had characterized his earlier transformation, these years involved careful maintenance of what had already been achieved. His government worked to ensure that the break with Rome, the redistribution of monastic lands, and the strengthened powers of the monarchy would endure beyond his personal presence. Observers at court could sense both the strength and the fragility of this legacy. The monarchy stood more powerful than it had for centuries, yet much of that power had been forged through the personality of one man. The question remained whether it could function as effectively without him. Henry himself seemed aware of this dilemma. He issued detailed instructions, revised his will, and attempted to shape the political environment his successors would inherit. In doing so, he sought to extend his influence into the future, ensuring that the order he created would not dissolve with his passing. When he died in January 1547, the reaction across England was complex. There was mourning for a king who had ruled for nearly 4 decades and whose presence had dominated national life. There was also uncertainty about what would follow. The transformation he had overseen was undeniable. England was no longer a peripheral kingdom bound tightly to continental authority, but a state with a distinct religious identity and a monarchy of unprecedented reach. Henry's legacy did not rest solely on the controversies that surrounded his reign, nor solely on the institutions he reshaped. It lay in the lasting redefinition of kingship itself. Before him, English monarchs had operated within a network of shared authoritas nobility, church, and tradition. After him, the crown stood at the center of national life with new clarity and strength. Governance, faith, and loyalty had been drawn into closer alignment than ever before. In the decades that followed, England would continue to wrestle with the consequences of his decisions. Religious conflict, political adaptation, and the evolving balance between authority and belief all trace their origins to the structures he established. Yet regardless of how later generations judged his methods, the scale of his impact could not be denied. He had altered the trajectory of his kingdom, forging a model of monarchy defined not only by inheritance but by the deliberate exercise of power. Thus the story of his final years is not merely one of decline, but of culmination. The energetic Prince of 1509, the determined ruler who defied papal authority, and the commanding sovereign who reshaped institutions all converged in an aging king, determined to secure what he had built. His life closed as it had long been lived at the center of decisions that bound personal will to national destiny, leaving behind a kingdom permanently marked by the force of his reign. The death of Henry VIII did not bring an end to the forces he had set in motion. In many ways, it marked the true beginning of their consequences. A ruler's lifetime can impose change through command, but it is only after that ruler is gone that a nation discovers whether those changes were temporary disruptions or lasting transformations. In Henry's case, England found itself living within a framework so thoroughly reshaped that it could not simply return to what had existed before. The monarchy, the church, the nobility, and even ordinary patterns of loyalty had been permanently altered, and the decades that followed would test how deeply those alterations had taken root. At the heart of this legacy was the new relationship between authority and identity. Before Henry's reign, allegiance to the crown and allegiance to the universal church had existed in a delicate partnership. After his break with Rome and the consolidation of royal supremacy, that partnership was gone. England now possessed a religious structure inseparable from its political leadership, and this fusion meant that questions of belief could quickly become questions of obedience. Later generations would wrestle with this reality, sometimes embracing it, sometimes resisting it, but never escaping it. The young Edward VI, who succeeded his father, inherited not only a throne but an experiment in governance, unlike any England had known. Because Edward was a minor, real authority passed into the hands of regents and councillors, men tasked with preserving the system Henry had built while also guiding it through a new era. Their challenge revealed one of the central tensions of Henry's achievement. He had created a monarchy of immense strength, yet much of its effectiveness depended on the force of his own personality. Without that commanding presence, those who governed in his name had to interpret how far his principles should be extended. Under Edward's advisors, reforms moved further in a Protestant direction than Henry himself had fully embraced. This demonstrated how the institutional independence from Rome that Henry established could be used to justify very different theological outcomes. The machinery of change was now firmly in English hands, capable of moving in multiple directions depending on who controlled it. What Henry had initiated as a solution to dynastic crisis became, in practice, a continuing redefinition of national faith. The accession of Elizabeth I later in the century illustrated another dimension of Henry's long shadow. Elizabeth's reign is often remembered for stability and cultural flourishing, yet that stability rested heavily upon the structures her father created. She inherited a kingdom accustomed to looking to the monarch as the final authority in both secular and spiritual matters. Her ability to navigate religious compromise, political challenge, and international rivalry depended on the centralized state Henry had forged. Even when she moderated or adjusted policies, she did so within boundaries he had drawn. Beyond politics and religion, Henry's reign also reshaped the social and economic landscape. The redistribution of former monastic lands created a new class of landowners whose fortunes were tied to the continuation of Tudor authority. Families who acquired these estates became invested in maintaining the changes that had granted them wealth and influence. Over time, this altered the composition of England's governing elite, blending older noble houses with newer figures elevated through service and royal favor. The consequences reached far into local society, affecting patterns of patronage, agriculture, and regional leadership. Culturally, memories of Henry's dramatic decisions lingered in chronicles, sermons, and popular imagination. Stories of his court, its magnificence as well as its danger circulated widely, shaping perceptions of monarchy for generations. He became a figure both admired and feared, representing the possibilities and perils of concentrated power. Later rulers were measured against his example, sometimes invoking his authority to justify their own policies, sometimes distancing themselves from the severity associated with his name. The legal and administrative precedents established during his reign also endured. Parliament had been used repeatedly to legitimize sweeping change, demonstrating that even revolutionary measures could be framed through established institutions. This practice strengthened the role of statute in English governance, showing that transformation need not come solely through conquest or rebellion, but could proceed through legislative means. The balance between royal initiative and parliamentary participation would remain a defining feature of English political development in the centuries ahead. Yet Henry's legacy was not one of unbroken continuity. The very scale of his reforms ensured that they would provoke debate long after his death. Some viewed his actions as the birth of a sovereign national state, freed from external control and capable of charting its own destiny. Others saw them as the origin of religious division and political absolutism. These contrasting interpretations became part of England's historical consciousness, influencing how later generations understood authority, conscience, and resistance. On a more personal level, Henry's life left an enduring lesson about the relationship between character and power. His early promise as a cultivated Renaissance prince demonstrated how education and charisma could inspire admiration, while his later severity showed how fear, insecurity, and determination could reshape leadership into something far more commanding. The transformation was neither instantaneous nor inevitable. It emerged from a series of decisions driven by circumstance, belief, and ambition. This complexity makes his reign one of the most studied examples of how individual psychology can intersect with institutional change. By the end of the 16th century, England was unmistakably different from the realm Henry had inherited in 1509. It was more centralized, more conscious of its national identity, and more accustomed to the idea that monarchy could act decisively in shaping both governance and belief. These developments did not end with the Tudors. They influenced the evolution of the English state well into the modern era. Debates about sovereignty, religion, and the limits of authority all bore traces of the precedents established during Henry's rule. Thus, the true measure of his reign lies not only in the dramatic events that filled his lifetime, but in the structures that survived him. He left behind no simple legacy of tyranny or triumph, but a reconfigured kingdom whose institutions carried the imprint of his will. England moved forward, adapting and contesting what he had made, yet never entirely escaping it. The monarch who had once sought merely to secure a dynasty ultimately transformed the nature of kingship itself, ensuring that his influence would persist long after his own voice had fallen silent. The reign of Henry VIII, stretching over 37 years, represents a turning point in the history of England, not only for its dramatic political and religious changes, but for the profound impact it had on the very perception of monarchy itself. By the time of his death, the kingdom had been transformed from a relatively insular, traditionally governed nation into a state with centralized authority, capable of exercising power over every aspect of governance and daily life. Henry's life illustrates how personal ambition, political necessity, and religious conviction can converge to create a rule that is both formidable and enduring. The consolidation of royal authority initiated during his reign reshaped the balance of power between the crown and other social institutions. Before Henry, England's monarchy had operated alongside a variety of semi-autonomous entities, including the nobility, the church, and municipal governments. Monarchs had to negotiate with these groups, often relying on persuasion, patronage, and shared custom to maintain control. Henry, however, systematically dismantled competing sources of power. Through the dissolution of the monasteries, he removed a vast network of ecclesiastical influence and wealth that had previously acted as an independent counterweight to royal authority. Lands and assets that once supported religious orders were brought under direct royal control or redistributed to loyal subjects, creating a political and economic landscape in which allegiance to the king became the central determinant of status and opportunity. This centralization of power extended to the legal system. The expansion of statutory law under Henry's reign meant that significant aspects of governance were no longer based solely on precedent or local custom, but could be codified and enforced uniformly across the realm. Parliament became a crucial instrument of authority, legitimizing measures that would have been considered radical in earlier reigns. The statutes passed under Henry VIII established new procedures for succession, the regulation of the church, and the punishment of dissent, reinforcing the supremacy of the monarch. In doing so, Henry demonstrated that monarchy could be both flexible and absolute, capable of enacting reforms that fundamentally altered the structure of society. Religious change was among the most enduring of Henry's transformations. The creation of the Church of England, with the king as its supreme head, represented a profound reorientation of spiritual authority. By removing the Pope's influence, Henry centralized control over doctrine, clerical appointments, and church revenues. Religious conformity was now inseparable from loyalty to the crown. While Henry maintained many traditional practices, his reforms established a precedent for the English state to govern religious matters independently of foreign powers. The ripple effects of this decision would reverberate for generations, creating both opportunities for reformers and sources of conflict that later monarchs would have to navigate with caution. Henry's personal approach to governance also left an indelible mark on political culture. Unlike predecessors who relied primarily on counsel from the nobility or the established clergy, he demonstrated that the monarch's personality could shape policy, law, and social expectation. His temper, ambition, and decisiveness made the crown the ultimate arbiter of power. Figures such as Thomas Cromwell, Thomas More, and Anne Boleyn illustrate how proximity to the king could elevate individuals to extraordinary influence, or conversely, expose them to sudden peril. The court became a microcosm of the broader state, where observation, loyalty, and political acumen determined survival and advancement. The impact of Henry's reign extended beyond the elite to society at large. Redistribution of monastic lands changed the patterns of land ownership and local power, influencing the economy, agriculture, and social hierarchy. Communities accustomed to the charity, education, and social services provided by religious institutions had to adapt to new sources of support, often under direct royal oversight or through landlords newly empowered by the crown. The dissolution of the monasteries did not merely increase the king's wealth, it redefined the social contract, altering the relationship between rulers and subjects in ways that highlighted dependency on central authority. Internationally, Henry's assertive policies altered England's position in Europe. His break with Rome initially isolated the kingdom diplomatically, but it also freed England to pursue alliances and strategies without deference to papal interests. Henry's marriages, wars, and treaties demonstrated that sovereignty could no longer be subordinate to continental powers. England's emerging identity as an autonomous state capable of independent religious and political action owed much to his assertive exercise of authority. Foreign rulers learned to negotiate with England as a self-determining entity, not merely a client of the papacy or European dynastic alliances. Henry's influence also extended into cultural life. His court had been a center of art, music, and learning, fostering the development of Renaissance ideals within England. Although the later years of his reign were marked by a harsher political climate, the cultural achievements of the early Tudor court helped establish patterns of patronage and artistic ambition that would flourish under Elizabeth and beyond. Education, literature, and courtly display were all infused with a sense that monarchy could embody both authority and refinement, even as the mechanisms of power grew more formidable. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of Henry's legacy was the intertwining of fear and loyalty as tools of governance. His willingness to execute those who challenged his authority, whether for personal, political, or religious reasons, sent a clear message about the consequences of dissent. Yet this same enforcement of obedience also stabilized the realm, ensuring that reforms and laws could be implemented without continual resistance. Future rulers observed the balance he struck between intimidation and administration, recognizing that power derived as much from the perception of authority as from formal structures. The succession he secured through Edward VIII, and later the inclusion of Mary and Elizabeth, demonstrated foresight in planning for dynastic continuity. By ensuring that the Tudor line remained intact, Henry minimized the immediate risk of civil strife while embedding the principle that the legitimacy of rulership depended on both bloodline and centralized enforcement. The careful structuring of succession laws under his reign became a template for managing transitions, illustrating how foresight, legislation, and personal will could be combined to shape the future of a kingdom. Yet Henry's reign was not without contradiction. His personal desires often drove national policy, and his decisions could produce turmoil as well as order. His marriages, religious reforms, and executions reflected a blending of private ambition with public authority, demonstrating how the two could become inseparable in an era when the monarch embodied the state. This duality between the personal and the political helped define his reputation as both a feared and revered ruler. The very unpredictability that made him dangerous also made him formidable, instilling a sense of awe and caution in those who interacted with the crown. In retrospect, Henry VIII's reign can be understood as a decisive moment in the evolution of English monarchy. It demonstrates how the consolidation of power, the redefinition of religious and legal structures, and the force of personal will can transform a nation. The institutions, cultural patterns, and political expectations that he established persisted well beyond his lifetime, influencing the decisions of Edward VIII, Mary I, Elizabeth I, and subsequent monarchs. England's ability to assert itself religiously, politically, and culturally on the European stage owes much to the structures and precedents forged during his rule. The fear and respect inspired by Henry were inseparable from his achievements. Subjects, nobles, and foreign powers alike recognized that authority under Henry VIII was not abstract, it was immediate, enforceable, and personal. The combination of centralized power, legal authority, and personal force created a model of kingship that would endure as both a caution and an example. Later historians, writers, and political thinkers would grapple with the lessons of his reign, debating the costs and benefits of concentrated authority, the relationship between ruler and subject, and the moral dimensions of absolute power. Henry VIII's transformation from a cultured young prince to one of England's most feared monarchs illustrates the interplay between circumstance, ambition, and historical necessity. His personal struggles, physical, emotional, and dynastic-shaped decisions that reverberated through institutions, communities, and generations. His reign exemplifies the capacity of an individual to redirect the course of a nation through a combination of intellect, determination, and, at times, ruthless action. In the long arc of English history, Henry VIII remains a figure of paradox, brilliant yet terrifying, innovative yet authoritarian, inspiring yet exacting. His life and reign encapsulate the challenges of monarchy, the burdens of succession, and the far-reaching consequences of personal will when combined with institutional authority. By examining the totality of his influence, political, religious, social, and cultural, we see not merely the story of one man, but the transformation of a kingdom and the enduring legacy of a monarch who redefined what it meant to rule England. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the darker side of royal history, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more stories from the past that changed the world forever. Because history isn't just about what happened, it's about why it still matters today.